Okay. Hi, it is so great to be back here again. I'm Dr. Carol Baus, and the last time I saw you folks was back in September 2018 in Newport, Wales. And it was a wonderful experience. I really enjoyed it. And so it's really great to be back with you all. I really like this group, and I think you're doing some amazing things. The topic that we're going to talk about today is the potential of neo-shamanic practices to overcome transgenerationally transmitted wounds. I'm going to talk about ancestors. And for that, I'm going to start off with a little quote from Gilbert and Sullivan. I'm sure you are all familiar with the Pirates of Penzance. And the first quote we have for the day comes from Major General Stanley in Act 2, when he says to Frederick, "I don't know whose ancestors they were, but I do know whose ancestors they are. And I shudder to think that their descendant by purchase, if I may so describe myself, should have brought disgrace upon what I have no doubt was an unstained escutcheon." The idea of ancestors by purchase, I kind of get that because geography remembers, the place remembers, but the ancestry comes from your DNA. It comes from my DNA. We are the sum of our parts. And the idea of ancestors as transmitters of trauma, whether it's collective trauma or personal trauma, is not a new one, but it's only been within the past few years that the working with ancestors has become an accepted augmentation to therapy. There's a lot of work that can be done with it. Mark Wolyn's It Didn't Start With You has been kind of a groundbreaking book, at least over here in the United States. I don't know if y'all have it over there. I would imagine you do. It's an Amazon bestseller. Great book. And personally, I had been working on two books. The first one, Neo-shamanism and Mental Health, and the other, Transgenerational Colonialism, Wounding, Overcoming, and the Reconstruction of Personal Identity. And they sort of melded together into a mashup. And I began to think, what if neo-shamanic technique could be used in a way that could enable us to contact our ancestors in a shamanic state and basically act as their therapist to help them get over some of the traumas that they had coming at them both collectively and personally. So I made up kind of a proof. I was never that good in geometry, but sometimes it comes back to help a little bit. So the proof is this: if the trauma wounding underlying epigenetic triggering is transmitted via ancestors through inherited DNA modification, and if one can interact with those ancestors using neo-shamanic techniques, then it might be possible to diminish the impact of triggering by helping ancestors overcome the traumatic wounding event and enable living descendants to deal with the triggering in a less volatile manner going forward. So let's begin this exploration by taking a look at transgenerational transmission of trauma. Now, trauma is both personal and collective. Personal trauma is something that I think we all endure it as we grow up. And a lot of times it has a slight PTSD type of effect because something happens and it resonates. It becomes self-limiting beliefs. For example, really, really wanting that part in the school play and not getting it, and getting that negative belief that I'm just not good at acting or any of the performing arts. And that can go with somebody going forward so that they clam up and freeze during auditions or public speaking or something like that. They can be small things. Collective trauma usually comes as a result of a major social cataclysm, like a war or a displacement, something like that. And the odd thing is that these events modify our DNA so that it's passed down through our ancestors. And that may seem a little far out, but it's not. Transgenerational transmission of trauma is something that we see all the time when you see these conflicts that continually flare up. Attitudes from generations, memories from generations. Where did that come from? Oh, wow, that came from my 5 times removed great-grandmother during the Civil War. And you wonder, but when you start opening your mind to the collective, these things begin to manifest, and we can trace them to our ancestors. So how do we start with this? The first way that things are transmitted is through epigenetics, which is the modification of the DNA, which triggers things. It's a memory. It's like a landmine that's sitting there. Epigenetics itself is the study of how events, behaviors, and the environment can change the way genes operate. They've done an awful lot of research with people who survived the Dutch hunger winter of 1944-1945 that caused starvation by death for a fairly frightening percentage of the population in the Netherlands. The actress Audrey Hepburn was someone who lived through that, and it never left her. I don't know if she felt guilty or grateful that she survived, but it really helped spur her taking on human rights work and taking care of children and starving children when she retired from acting in the later part of her life. They found that particularly things like famine are carried through the male DNA. Generally, things like that generally come from the father's side, which is interesting. And traumas are traumatic memories are like anything that anything else that's handed down genetically, such as artistic ability. So you may have inherited your great-great-grandfather's athletic ability, but at the same time, you also inherited his fear of snakes, for example. These are things we can't explain. Where did that come from? So epigenetics, the actual modification of the DNA, is one way it gets transferred. The other thing is stories. On the collective level, there are tales of heroes, there's tales of abuses, there's tales of trauma. On the family level, I don't think there's a person alive who has not wanted to go under the rug when their father or uncle laughingly recounts to the whole family at Christmas probably the most embarrassing moment in your life. So that reinforces the idea that there's something that you can't do. There's some place where you're lacking. Not that that wasn't an abusive thing. It just happens, and then everybody laughs. Ha ha! It's funny, but it's really it reinforces a negative belief. Attitudes that get passed on. The whole idea that there's certain groups of people that are bad, you can't trust them because of things that happened sometimes centuries in the past. It's also reinforced through child rearing practices. Parents want to protect their children. They want to protect them against bad people. And they want to protect them against the thing they fear, and they are themselves the vectors of that fear in their attempt to protect their kids. Community is another way that this is, that trauma is passed on transgenerationally, particularly in areas, for example, New York City, where you have specific neighborhoods that are ethnically based. It's probably not quite that way so much anymore, but it used to be that there was an Italian neighborhood, there was an Irish neighborhood, there was a Jewish neighborhood. All these neighborhoods were little ethnic bubbles, and people learned the customs, the traditions, the beliefs, the core values that held that community together. They learned the language. So that was something that reinforced some traumatic ideas, some prejudice, some bias, attitudes. Again, these are carried forth in the schools, in the church, in peer groups. You think about the Sharks and the Jets in West Side Story. And a good current example of this dynamic is in the show Dairy Girls, which is absolutely, I think, one of the funniest shows on television. But the writers have put in this dynamic of the community antagonism that exists in the Protestant and Catholic neighborhoods in Derry. There's some great lines in there, but you see it, and it's not up front and center so much, but it's an unwritten attitude. It's part of the paradigm. And then again, through the culture. The culture itself is one that tends to emphasize differences. And again, if you have a newspaper or a magazine or a network, a mass media network that has a particular point of view, these ideas are carried forward. Particularly, for example, if there is a group that has been traumatized through something like lack of civil rights, enslavement, abuse, that sort of thing, that will create a group in the media that becomes integrated into the tapestry of the culture as a whole. The difference between trauma and wounding is significant, because wounding is a trauma that results in the diminishment of one's identity and self-worth. A simple trauma, such as a natural disaster, can ostensibly be healed through the application of psychotherapeutic protocols over time, but wounding must be overcome in order for the person to reconstruct a positive identity. If you have a wounding such as, or a trauma such as, for example, living through a hurricane or an earthquake, and you have to relocate, I mean, it's horrible. It's frightening and it's disruptive, but it doesn't diminish who you are as a person. When you endure a wounding that diminishes your own self-worth, that has a negative effect on your identity, that's when it's something that has to be overcome. And you can't put band-aids on that. It requires a real reconstruction of identity. So as I was working on transgenerational colonialism, I was getting all of this information, all of these ideas, results of all of this research. And I had to get a way to organize it. I had to have a model to work with. And I came up with the idea of the wounding overcoming cycle. It was an organizing process in writing this book. And it was focused on colonialism, but the idea of personal wounding and overcoming was also part of it, because you cannot endure a collective trauma, wounding, without it having a personal effect. That's all there is to it. It's if you're in a, particularly if you're in an ethnic group that is looked down upon and considered less than. For example, when many of the Irish came over to the United States in the 19th century, they formed their own communities, but they were also looked down on. There were signs up that said, no Irish need apply. There was a resistance to their presence, particularly in the areas of the Northeast where they tended to settle a lot. Okay, I'm not good enough. I'm Irish. I'm not part of this. That's something that stays with you for a long time, for many generations. And it took a long time for the Irish to become the political and social and economic force that they currently are. And in the case of the United States, they're very much integrated into the fabric of general American culture. But anyone who is an individual in that group that is being looked down upon and belittled, again, has that wounding, that lack of, that sense of a diminished identity. So the wounding overcoming cycle, actually, whether it's personal or collective, has three phases. The first is the wounding phase, which is the phase of identity diminishment. And first there's the wounding event. And then the separation for others. It's like life is going on, but I'm different. Something has happened. I'm different. There's cultural dissonance because a wound makes someone feel very much like they are, they don't see the world the same way. It's shifted. There's been a shift in perspective. The depreciated self-worth. This has happened to me. It was my fault. It can even be guilt. That whole thing that drives PTSD, particularly with war veterans. My entire squad got blown up, but I survived. Why did I survive? This can happen on a personal level. If something happened where members of the family were wiped out, but one person managed to escape it. Why did that happen? I mean, that's why. It's a real driver of post-traumatic stress. And also the acceptance of the diminished identity. I'm not a good person. I can't do this. I'm not good enough. And this is transmitted transgenerationally. It doesn't have to have happened to you personally, but happen to any of your ancestors that are your direct ancestors. I'm not talking uncles, aunts, cousins. I'm talking parents, grandparents, great-grandparents, that direct bloodline. Then at some point with a lot of people, there is what's called a turning point. It is that point where they just figure they can't take it anymore. They either have to fight it or else they have to just die. And some do. Some just curl up and decide they don't want to live anymore. Whereas others decide they're going to fight it. They can't go through like this. There's something happens that gives them a glimmer that they are not going to keep going the way they are. And that triggers the overcoming phase, which is the reconstruction of a positive identity. And in this part, they discover the lost identity. They figure out who they were before the traumatizing event happened. They reclaim that lost identity. It's like, I was this person who was happy, who was strong, who was giving and enjoying life. And then this happened. And I no longer saw myself that way. I saw myself as weak. I saw myself as helpless. I saw myself as disempowered. And it's reclaiming that former positive identity, which can be revitalized with added value once they overcome the effects of the traumatizing wounding event. And then it's a matter of integrating that reinforced, revitalized positive identity with who they are today. So our ancestors went through this. I'm sure everybody's had one or two ancestors that went through something pretty awful, personally or collectively or both. But because of the mechanics of epigenetics, their pain, their wounding, if it was not resolved, resonates with us. And it causes us to get triggered, whether it's having horrible stage fright and completely spazzing at an athletic tryout or an audition, or whether it's something that has more collective overtones to it. We have it. Now, what might the application of neo-shamanic techniques do to help us ameliorate the triggering effects of ancestral memory of wounding that can impact a contemporary individual? This is where it gets more into the transpersonal, but it's also very personal, because what you end up doing is contacting your ancestor using neo-shamanic technique and basically becoming sort of a therapist or coach for your ancestor. The neo-shamanic journey is the core technique of neo-shamanic practice. And when I say neo-shamanism, I'm referring to the contemporary practice of basically Western people who have discovered the use of traditional indigenous shamanic techniques and worldview, and they have applied it, integrated it into their daily life, but at the same time, they do not have a culture that supports this. We definitely were tribal millennia ago, less than millennia, just 1 millennia ago, and yet we've forgotten that to a large extent because of the course of history and civilization in Europe and the areas of the world that were colonized by Europeans. So a neo-shamanic practitioner is someone who uses core shamanic techniques but does not have a supporting culture, which is a whole different story, and I won't go into it right now. But in neo-shamanic practice, the basis of it is the act of entering into an altered state of consciousness from a normal waking state at will and with a specifically stated purpose. It's not like a psychedelic experience where anything goes. It's not a dream experience where, again, you're sleeping and your limbic system opens up and you don't have any agency. You did not have a purpose for this dream. It simply happened. Unless it's a lucid dream, that's a whole other story too. The altered state of consciousness used by most neo-shamanic practitioners is a steady, repetitive drumming that slows and broadens the brain waves, so that when one is in this shamanic altered state, they're somewhere between hypnagogic and phase 2 sleep. And it really is a shift of consciousness. What's happening is there all the time. We just don't perceive it in normal waking consciousness. Our sensory cognitive apparatus is designed to keep us focused on the material world, basically to ensure our chances of survival. So these things are happening outside of our realm of perception, but when we are in that altered state, the physical cognitive senses shut down and we're open to some of the other phenomena that we don't ordinarily see in normal waking consciousness. We are able to perceive and interact with phenomena that are not perceivable in the waking state. including the spirits of deceased ancestors. And Adam Rock and Stanley Krippner did some wonderful research to come up with this model. And I think it's really great. They wrote an article in 2007, but it's an outstanding article and a model I've used for many years. Using the neo-shamanic technique of journey facilitates direct contact and interaction with your ancestors. You may not even have met these people because they lived in the 1800s. It allows you to listen to, or in some cases even see, their story. What happened? Their personal wounding is there for you to understand. They can tell you, they can show you. And this provides you, as the descendant, to work with this ancestor to help them overcome that wounding so that you don't get triggered quite as readily. Or if you do, you can at least objectify it and say, oh my God, that was my 6 times great-grandfather. Or if they are haunting, and a lot of haunts, haints, ghosts are part of the spirit of people who still have business to do. They're the ones that show up at the foot of your bed at 2:30 in the morning, or that haunt places where something happened. You can release them. If they can overcome what happened to them, they can frequently be released. And so it's like a reverse, it's like a posthumous soul retrieval, so that the part of the soul that's still here in the material plane in a rather dissociated form can be, using psychopomp work, be reunited with the rest of the entity that has passed on. That's a very prominent tenet in shamanic practice. So it gives you the opportunity to explain, after you listen to your ancestor, to explain what happened in a historical cultural context, if that's applicable. Explain to them what's happened since. That's very big, especially if it's something along the personal line that results in guilt. Show them what talents and gifts they've passed on. Show yourself to them as their future manifestation. It's like, you're living in me now. Your genetic material is in me and is part of me. And this is what it's doing. This is what I'm doing with my life, thanks to you in a large extent. You can discuss the repercussions of their wounds. You can let them talk about their pain. And sometimes it's just a matter of listening to them. And you can explain to them the need to overcome the wounding for the sake of the descendants, particularly if that has resulted in fear or depreciated self-identity or anger. Boy, anger fuels a lot of stuff. Unresolved ancestral anger fuels a lot of the mess that we have in the world going on. You can create a supportive, positive matrix within which your ancestor can help. You can help your ancestor overcome. This is where the shamanic practitioner becomes, neo-shamanic practitioner becomes the therapist for your ancestor. Thank your ancestor for their courage and welcome the wisdom that they gained through their wounding and overcoming. Reassure them that you will listen to their voice as part of your own personal council of ancestors. We all have a council of ancestors. The ancestors live within us. We hear their voices. Sometimes we don't understand where it came from because it came from somebody 4 generations back. And this, I've taught workshops in using this technique to deal with ancestors, and it's just remarkable how many people come back from these journeys and say, I always had this, I always reacted to this, and nobody could understand why that was. And I just talked to my great-great-grandfather, and it came from him. It wasn't me, it was him, but it is you. So the overcoming works both ways, both for the person who's acting as the practitioner and also for the ancestor. You reassure them that they'll be part of your council of ancestors. I think the whole idea of ancestry is the basis of what Dick Schwartz used in his model of integrated family systems, but he refers to these as persons rather than ancestors, but reiterates the fact that you yourself are the driver. They don't call the shots, but they can have opinions that are very honored. Then reinforce that honoring in a material way with some kind of ritual, light a candle, some kind of creative expression, a painting, a short one-act play. Draw a picture of your ancestor, but do something to honor them, because that also reinforces their positive identity and their value. And once the ancestral voice experience perspective has been identified and the wounding overcome by the ancestor, then it becomes possible for us to objectify the epigenetic triggering when it shows up. And when it shows up, again, it's just like you stepped on a landmine. It's like something, you'll see something on the news or read something or hear something, and boom. It's like, whoa, where did that come from? Knowing where it came from is really helpful, because then you can say, yes, great-great-grandmother Hattie, I understand that what happened during Sherman's March to the Sea and how it really was a horrible thing that happened to the family at that time. Actually, it's more than two greats, but you don't get as angry, and you can talk about it in a way that is separate and objective, but honoring all the same. And again, a lot of times if there is a spirit of part of an ancestral spirit that is hanging around because something is unresolved, then that can be released. And that's really important. So it puts you in the driver's seat, which is really important. In conclusion, the personal and transpersonal are totally enmeshed. And in many cases, particularly those of war, displacement, persecution, forced labor or abuse of human and civil rights, or severe personal wounding, it's important to overcome the personal wounding in order for the transpersonal to be overcome and recovery to occur. Neo-shamanic techniques, because of their power to pierce the veil of interdimensionality, enable us to communicate directly with our wounded ancestors and facilitate their overcoming of their personal as well as collective wounds, and reconstruct a revitalized and integrated positive identity. The value of ancestral work as an adjunct to standard therapeutic practice has been increasingly recognized over the past 10 years, most notably by Mark Wallen, and It Didn't Start With You, that came out in 2017. Again, this particular format came out of research from my two books, Neo-shamanism and Mental Health and Transgenerational Colonialism, as well as through workshops that I've taught that have been testing these theories out over the past 5 years. There's a lot of research to be done here, and I'm really hoping that this is part of a trend that will spark the interest of academics and therapists, so that ancestor work becomes an integral part of the therapeutic process and the psychology curricula in colleges and universities. So once again, I want to thank you all for having me here today, and I hope that you're having a great conference. I wish you all a good academic year ahead, and I'm very happy to answer any questions. or get any feedback from you on all of this. Thank you so much.